In this short video, I'm going to show you a very simple hack you can use to improve the performance of a plastic feed in a flex pen. And while it's not a perfect solution by any means, the great thing about it is that it's completely reversible and will not damage or alter your pen in any way. So you can try it, see if it works for you, and if it doesn't, no big deal. Here's a TWSBI VAC 700R. While it's not my favorite pen, it is a useful one in that it's a vacuum filler that uses a number 6 size nib. This means that it can be used with a huge number of other nibs, including the wonderfully flexy Fountain Pen Revolution number 6 Ultra Flex nib. Unfortunately, this combination doesn't work very well because when you flex it, the pen starts to railroad almost immediately. My initial assumption was that the plastic feed in the TWSBI doesn't provide enough ink flow. That makes perfect sense, since generally speaking, modern feeds are not designed for the ink demands of flex nibs and provide only enough flow for regular writing. Vintage pens, thankfully, don't have this problem because the feeds have a more generous ink flow and because they're made of ebonite, which is a more porous, hydrophilic material that allows ink to flow through it more effectively than plastic. Fortunately for those using modern flex pens, you can buy an ebonite replacement for a number of pens, including the wonderful Pilot 912 FA and the Pilot 743 FA. Unfortunately, their selection of feeds is limited, so what to do if you want to use a flex nib in a modern pen with a modern plastic feed? You could widen the channel of the feed with a razor, but there are a few problems with this hack. The cut you make will not be precise, and the scratches inside the channel might impede the flow of ink. Or you might overdo it and make the pen write way too wet. This is a risky, irreversible hack that does work, but there is an easier, less risky way of improving flow. The fact is, the amount of flow that a feed provides is only one factor involved in what makes a flex pen write well. I have a number of flex pens that use ordinary plastic feeds that were not designed for flex that work quite well. For example, when I bought this Pilot 743 FA, I simultaneously bought a replacement ebonite feed for it, anticipating flow problems. It turned out that the 743 works just fine with its original plastic feed. Here are a few examples. This Opus 88 with a 14K custom ground semi-flex nib, or this Opus 88 with a vintage flex nib, both working just fine with the original ordinary plastic feeds. And here is a TWSBI 580 with a Fountain Pen Revolution number 5.5 nib that also works well, again using the original feed. While admittedly none of these flex pens are super flexy, they do work, and I believe that the reason is due to a very simple yet overlooked factor. Let's take a look at what's happening to the number 6 FPR Ultra Flex nib when it's flexed. Notice that the nib is pulling away from the feed. At a certain point, the surface tension of the ink breaks and ink can no longer reach the tines, causing railroading. A more generous ink flow would certainly help things, but I think even if the flow were better, there would still be problems. In my opinion, this pulling away from the feed is actually the cause of most of the railroading in modern flex pens. Let's examine the interaction of nib and feed on this vintage Wahl Gold Seal pen. When the pen is flexed, the nib stays close enough to the feed so that the surface tension is not broken. The additional flow provided by the ebonite feed also helps things, but if you look inside this nib, you'll see another factor. Vintage flex nibs have a rounded depression carved into them, allowing the nib to, in effect, wrap around the feed and make greater contact. The Fountain Pen Revolution number 6 nib, like all modern nibs, flex or not, is flat on the bottom, so the feed doesn't make as much contact. The reason the Opus 88 pens and the TWSBI 580 that I showed you work is because the nibs on all three are smaller, the number 5 size, and don't pull away from the feed quite as much as the number 6 sized nib. If you're using a pen with a modern ebonite feed and you're experiencing railroading, the solution is to heat set the feed. In heat setting, you warm up the nib and feed in very hot water, and once the ebonite has softened, press the feed tightly into the nib. If done right, this significantly improves the performance of the pen. My suspicion is that the reason why it's so effective is that it puts the ebonite feed under slight tension against the nib, so that when the pen is flexed, the nib doesn't pull away from the feed quite as much. While that trick works very well with ebonite, what do you do with plastic feeds? Plastic cannot be heat set after all. Well, here is my discovery. At least I think this is my discovery. While plastic in these feeds cannot be heat set, it can be deformed. Take the feed out of the pen, remove the nib, and place it in very hot water, just under boiling for about 20 seconds. This will make the feed slightly pliable, and then using a paper towel, gently curve the feed upward. The curve should be very slight. This way the feed will move back and forth when the nib is flexed and stay closer to it. While technically not heat setting, this slight deformation accomplishes essentially the same thing. And because the bend you're introducing is so slight, I think there's little risk involved in doing permanent damage. Here's the TWSBI VAX 700R with this feed hack, and as you can see, the performance is improved. It's nothing perfect, but it's better. And I've done this hack quite a few times, and it's worked in every case, so I'm confident enough that this is something that works. And if it doesn't, you can easily nudge the feed back to its original position with absolutely no damage done. That said, this is something that is still risky and probably shouldn't be done more than once, and is not something I would do to any feed that isn't easily replaced. So that's it. That's the hack. Let me know if this is something that works for you, or if you have any other tricks for improving ink flow. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to reply.